He slammed his walking stick against Evelyn's medical bag so hard it skidded across the platform and crashed into the iron railing, spilling her instruments onto the frozen ground. "Pick those up," Harlan Voss said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Go on. Pick up your little toys, old woman. Maybe you can practice pretending to be a doctor on someone else's family." The crowd on the platform went still. Not the polite kind of still. The kind where people want to look away but can't. Evelyn Harper, 57 years old, knelt slowly on the icy boards and gathered her things. Her hands didn't shake. That was the part nobody expected. Harlan wasn't finished. He never was. "My cousin trusted you," he said, voice rising. "Trusted a wandering old widow with no clinic, no license anyone can verify, and no business treating anyone. And what did he get for it? 3 weeks of suffering before a real doctor finally undid your damage." If you've ever watched someone be stripped of their dignity in public and done nothing, this story will reach somewhere deep. Stay until the end. You won't see the ending coming. And if it moves you, leave a like, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Evelyn Harper arrived at Redstone Junction, the temperature had been dropping since before dawn and showed no intention of stopping. She stepped off the westbound train carrying 2 things: a worn leather suitcase that had been repaired so many times the patches had patches, and a medical bag that was older than most of the men on the platform. She was 57, with gray threading through her dark hair and the kind of posture that came not from vanity but from years of standing upright when everything else tried to push her down. She had no reservation at any boarding house. She hadn't wired ahead, hadn't arranged anything. That wasn't carelessness. It was habit. Evelyn had been moving through small towns and railroad settlements for so long that planning ahead had started to feel like lying to herself about how welcome she'd actually be. Redstone Junction was a working town. Not pretty, not historic, just functional. A place where 3 rail lines crossed and the hotels filled up on Wednesday, and emptied by Friday, and the permanent residents had learned to ignore most of what passed through. The station itself was solid brick, built to last, with a covered platform that ran the length of 2 freight cars and a waiting area that smelled of coal smoke and coffee that had been sitting too long. Evelyn stood on that platform with her bag and her suitcase and looked for a porter's board or a notice about lodging. She found neither. What she found instead was Harlan Voss. She didn't know who he was yet. She just saw a large man in an expensive coat step off the same train 2 cars behind her, and she heard him before she fully registered him. His voice was the kind that assumed the world was waiting to hear it. "There she is," he said. She turned because the alternative was pretending she hadn't heard, and Evelyn had never been good at pretending. Harlan Voss was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had spent more time being satisfied than troubled. He wore the coat of a man who'd made real money, and he wore it the way some men wear money, like it was proof of something. "You rode the same line I did," he said. "I recognized you at the Millhaven stop." Evelyn looked at him steadily. She didn't recognize him at all. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't think we've met." "No," he agreed. "But I know who you are. Evelyn Harper, widow, calls herself a healer." He said the last word the way a man says a word he doesn't believe in. "My cousin Theodore lived in Millhaven. You treated him last spring." Something shifted in Evelyn's chest. Not guilt. She had examined her conscience about Theodore Voss more times than she could count, and she knew what she'd done and what she hadn't. But she recognized this conversation. She'd had versions of it before. "I remember Mr. Voss," she said carefully. "I'm sorry he had a difficult recovery." "A difficult recovery." Harlan laughed, and 2 men nearby looked up from their newspapers. "That's one way to say it. Another way is that my cousin spent 3 weeks in agony because of whatever you gave him, and it took Dr. Peterman driving up from Callaway to undo the mess you made." "That's not what happened," Evelyn said. "No?" His voice rose just enough to pull more attention. She could feel people turning, the way they always did when something looked like it might become a scene. "Theodore told me himself. Said you came in with all your little bottles and your little tools, and acted like you knew exactly what you were doing, said you were confident as anything. I was careful, Evelyn said. I diagnosed a kidney infection and treated it appropriately. The pain he experienced afterward was your fault. Harlan stepped closer, not threatening exactly, but using his size the way some men did, as punctuation. I've been asking around since Millhaven. You're not licensed. You've got no clinic, no hospital behind you, no one vouching for your credentials. You're just a woman who wanders around with a bag full of remedies and talks people into trusting you. There are letters, Evelyn said, from the medical college in letters. He cut her off and turned slightly, addressing not just her but the growing ring of bystanders. She's got letters. Well, that settles everything, doesn't it? There were a few sounds from the crowd, not quite laughter. Almost. An older man near the luggage cart said something to the woman beside him, too low to hear. A boy of about 12 stared openly with his mouth partway open. A woman in a gray wool coat pulled her small daughter a half step backward, like Evelyn might be contagious. Evelyn bent down and began collecting what had fallen from her medical bag. Her hands moved steadily. She had learned over years and towns and too many versions of this moment that shaking was the thing you couldn't afford. If your hand shook, you looked guilty. I treated 17 patients in Millhaven over 4 days, she said, her voice level. She wasn't talking to Harlan anymore. She understood now that Harlan didn't want an argument. He wanted an audience. So she spoke to the audience instead, quietly and directly, the way she'd speak to a patient who needed to hear something true. 11 of them recovered within the week. 4 had chronic conditions I couldn't reverse. One was Theodore Voss, who had a kidney infection complicated by something he hadn't told me about. And one was a child with scarlet fever who lived when everyone said she wouldn't. Silence. Then Harlan said, "Real touching. You know what else is real? You're an old woman with a beat-up bag and no place to stay, and this town doesn't need whatever you're selling." He picked up his own case and walked away, just like that, with the composed manner of a man who'd made his point. And the crowd, not all of them, but most of them, let the moment dissolve back into station noise, because that's what crowds do when no one steps forward. Evelyn stood there. The platform was cold. She was tired. She had $11 and some change in the bottom of her suitcase, and she didn't know a single person in Redstone Junction. She picked up the last of her instruments, checked the small glass bottles carefully for cracks, and straightened up. A station worker, young, maybe 20, with a red nose from the cold, hesitated near her for a moment. "Ma'am," he said, then seemed to lose his nerve and walked on. She watched the crowd thin, the train she'd arrived on pulling out of the station with a long hiss of steam, and she thought about what she always thought about in moments like this, whether the next town would be different and whether she was foolish for still believing it might be. Her name was Evelyn Harper. She was 57 years old. She had been a widow for 9 years and a healer for 31. She had set broken bones in mining camps, delivered babies in sod houses, and stayed through one outbreak of typhus that had emptied a cattle town of half its population. She had done all of this mostly alone, sometimes for payment and sometimes for nothing, always with the same worn leather bag. And she was standing on a cold platform in a town that had already decided what to think of her before she'd spent an hour in it. She picked up her suitcase. She would find a room. She always did. Nathan Cole had watched the whole thing from the far end of the platform. He was leaning against the wall near the freight office, drinking coffee from a tin cup and waiting on a parts shipment from the eastbound line. He was 42, lean and weathered in the way men get from spending years outside in all weather, with dark eyes that noticed things and a face that didn't broadcast what he thought about what he noticed. He'd seen Harlan Voss on the platform before the woman arrived, had actually been keeping a mild eye on Voss because the man had the restless, measuring look of someone who'd come to town with an agenda rather than just a destination. He'd watched the confrontation from start to finish without moving, and he didn't feel good about that, but he also hadn't been sure what to do with himself in the middle of someone else's business. What he kept coming back to, after Voss walked off and the crowd dispersed, and the woman stood there putting her instruments back in her bag, was the way she'd moved. No panic, no tears, no performance of dignity. Just actual dignity, which was different and rarer. He pushed off from the wall. He was halfway across the platform before he'd fully decided to do it. "Mrs. Harper," he said. She turned. Her expression was neutral in that way that people get when they're bracing for the next unpleasant thing. "I'm Nathan Cole," he said. "I run the freight operations here at the junction." He paused because the next part sounded strange in his head before he even said it. "I have a spare room, if you need somewhere to stay while you figure out the town." She looked at him for a long moment. Not suspicious exactly, more like she was trying to figure out what he was actually offering, because in her experience offers from strangers came in several varieties and most of them weren't what they appeared. "I don't take charity," she said. "It's not charity," he said. "It's a room. It's got its own entrance around the side of the house, and there's a lock on the door. No one would bother you." "You just watched a man tell an entire train station I'm not to be trusted," she said. "Yes. And you're offering me a room." "I don't care what Harlan Voss thinks about anything," Nathan said. It came out simpler than he meant it, but also more honest. "I've seen him work. He buys up debt and calls it business. Whatever he said about you, he said it for a reason that had nothing to do with your competence." Something moved behind her eyes. Not gratitude yet. More like recalibration. "The boarding houses are all full," she said. It wasn't a question. It was he realized her acknowledging that she'd already checked. "Railroad crews came in 2 days ago," he confirmed. "Every room between here and the mill road." She looked down at the medical bag in her hand, then back at him. "I'd want to be clear about terms," she said. "All right. I pay for my keep when I have money. When I don't, I'll work for it somehow. I don't borrow. I don't take meals from people without earning them." "That's fine," he said. "And I'll still treat patients," she said. "Whatever that man said, I'll still do what I do. If that's a problem for you." "It's not a problem," Nathan said. "Mrs. Harper, I watched you lose your instruments all over a frozen platform and put them back together without flinching. The town can think whatever it wants. I've got a room, and you need one. That's the beginning and end of my offer." She studied him for another moment. Then she said, "How far is the house?" It took them 15 minutes to walk from the station to Nathan's place, which was a small frame house set just outside the railway yard with a view of the signal tower and the constant low sound of iron and steam that Nathan had long since stopped hearing. He showed her the side entrance, a door that opened directly into what had been a storage room before he'd cleared it out and put in a cot and a small dresser, and gave her the key without ceremony. "There's a wood stove," he said. "Flue can stick in cold weather. You have to push the damper twice. Coffee's on the main stove from 5 in the morning, but you don't have to take it." "Thank you," she said. Just those 2 words, without elaboration. He nodded and went back to work. He had a freight inventory to reconcile and 3 crew supervisors waiting on him, and he'd spend enough time on a stranger's business for one morning. He told himself that on the walk back to the station. What he didn't tell himself, what he filed away in the back of his mind and didn't examine too closely, was that he'd watched Evelyn Harper stand on that platform under Harlan Voss's contempt and hold herself together with a steadiness that he found, though he had no real right to say it, genuinely remarkable. She set up her room in 20 minutes. Suitcase under the cot, medical bag on the dresser where she could reach it easily, spare instruments wrapped in cloth and arranged by type, the way she'd been arranging them since she was 26 years old and first learned that organization was its own form of calm. Then she sat on the edge of the cot and let herself be tired for exactly 5 minutes. It was something she'd taught herself to do, 5 minutes. Enough to acknowledge how she actually felt without living in it. After that, you got up and figured out what came next. What came next, in this case, was finding out whether she could get a patient or 2 before the week was out. Because $11 wasn't going to last, and she couldn't keep taking a room from a man she'd just met without some form of exchange. She had just pulled on a second pair of wool socks, the room was cold, the stove hadn't caught properly yet, when she heard voices from the direction of the main house. Then a knock on her door. She opened it to find Nathan Cole standing on the small step, and behind him, half supported by a teenage boy who looked terrified, was a man in railroad work clothes with blood soaking through the left leg of his trousers. "There's been an accident in the yard," Nathan said. His voice was controlled but tight at the edges. "One of the workers. The station doctor is in Callaway. Snowstorm has the road closed. I didn't know who else. Bring him in, Evelyn said. She didn't ask what had happened yet. She'd learned that the sequence mattered. Secure the patient first, gather the history second. She cleared the dresser with one sweep of her arm, and the boy helped her get the worker. A man named Declan, she'd learned, who was 34 and had 2 kids and a terror of hospitals, up onto it. The leg was bad. A freight coupling had caught him when a chain snapped, and the wound was deep and jagged and had been bleeding for some time by the look of the amount soaked into the cloth. Someone hold a lamp close, she said. Nathan took the lamp from the hook without being asked. She worked. She didn't narrate what she was doing or ask for reassurance or hesitate at the sight of it. She cleaned, she assessed, she made 2 decisions in quick succession, one about what she could close herself and one about what needed watching. And she did all of it with the economy of someone who'd done this kind of work for 3 decades in places with far less than a lit room and a steady hand holding the lamp. The boy, Declan's brother, it turned out, left twice to be sick in the yard. Nathan stayed. He didn't say anything. He held the lamp where she needed it, and when she asked for the second cloth from the top of her bag, he found it without fumbling, which told her he'd been paying attention the whole time. 40 minutes later, Declan's leg was cleaned and dressed, and he was conscious, pale, and complaining that he was going to be late getting home, which Evelyn took as a good sign. He needs to stay still tonight, she said. Not in this room, Syed. Somewhere he can lie flat with his leg elevated. Is there space in the main house? Nathan looked at Declan, then at her. I'll make space. He'll need the dressing changed in the morning. I'll come. Nathan nodded. The boy, his name was Pete, and he'd recovered enough to be embarrassed about the vomiting, said, How much does it cost, ma'am? I've only got... We'll sort that out when your brother is better, Evelyn said. Go get him some water and something to eat if there's food. Pete went. Nathan started to follow, then stopped at the door. That was good work, he said. It was necessary work, Evelyn said. She was already rewrapping her instruments. It's not the same thing. He looked at her for a moment with that steady, unreadable expression she was starting to recognize. No, he agreed. I suppose it isn't. He left. Evelyn sat down in the one chair in the room and looked at her hands. There was blood on them that she hadn't fully cleaned yet. Her back ached from bending over the makeshift table. The stove had finally caught, and the room was warming unevenly, hottest near the wall and still cold by the door. She was 57 years old, and she had just been publicly humiliated by a man with money and connections, and she was sleeping in a storage room she'd been in for less than 2 hours. She was also the reason a 34-year-old father with 2 children was going to go home from the railroad this week. She cleaned her hands. She made a note in the small journal she kept. Patient name, condition, treatment, date. Because that was the discipline of it, and discipline was what kept you honest with yourself. Then she went to check on Declan. Word traveled the way it always does in small towns, though not always in the direction you'd want. By the next morning, the story on the platform was that the widow woman Nathan Cole had brought home had stopped some railroad worker from bleeding to death. People told it different ways. Some emphasized the blood. Some emphasized Nathan. Some, particularly the people who'd been on the platform when Harlan Voss made his speech, didn't tell it at all because the story made them feel something they didn't have a comfortable name for. 3 people came to the side door of Nathan's house that day. A woman with an infected tooth who'd been waiting 3 weeks for the doctor to return. An older man who wouldn't say what was wrong until Evelyn sent Nathan outside and then confided in a rough whisper that he had a growth on his side he hadn't told his wife about because he was afraid of what it meant. A young woman, barely 19, who was pregnant and scared and had nobody in town she trusted enough to ask the questions she needed answered. Evelyn treated the tooth and the growth and answered every question the young woman asked, including the ones the young woman was too frightened to ask directly. She charged what people could pay and wrote off what they couldn't, the same way she always had. Nathan came home that evening to find a small pile of coins on the kitchen table with a note in careful handwriting. Week 1, room and board. Partial. We'll settle the rest as it comes. E. Harper. He looked at the coins for a moment, then put them in the tin box on the shelf where he kept household funds, and didn't say anything about it. Declan came back 3 days later to have his dressing changed, walking with a cane and looking sheepish. "My wife wants to know if you make house calls," he said, before Evelyn had even gotten his bandage off. "Depends on what for," she said. "Her mother. Joints, mostly. Hard to get around since November." "Tell her to come by," Evelyn said, "or I'll come to her, either way." Declan watched her work for a moment with the frank curiosity of a man who decided he liked someone and wasn't embarrassed about it. "That Voss fella," he said. "On the platform. Everybody saw that." "I know," Evelyn said. "He's been in town before, comes through every few months, buys up notes from people who owe on their property." "I see." "Point being," Declan said, "that a lot of people in this town don't think much of him either. They just don't always say so out loud." Evelyn secured the new dressing. "Hold still." "Yes, ma'am." She finished, checked her work, and sat back. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. "It doesn't change anything either way, but thank you." Declan stood, tested his weight on the leg, grimaced a little. "How long before I can go back to work?" "A week," she said. "Maybe 10 days. Don't push it." "The foreman's going to—" "Tell your foreman to come talk to me if he has a problem with it," Evelyn said. Declan grinned. It was the first grin she'd seen in that room. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, and this time he sounded like he meant it differently. Yep. Nathan noticed things about her the way he noticed things about rail operations. Not because he was looking for problems, but because paying attention was how he functioned. He noticed that she was up before 5 every morning, but never took the coffee until it had been sitting long enough to cool a little. Because, she explained without prompting one morning, hot coffee made her hands unsteady, and she couldn't afford unsteady hands. He noticed that she never turned a patient away at the door, even when she was clearly tired. Not performing tired, but actually tired, the kind that showed in the fine lines around her eyes. He noticed that she talked to patients differently than she talked to him. With patients, there was this particular quality of attention, like she'd turned everything else down. With him, she was more, he searched for the right word and settled on direct, like she'd decided he could handle the full version of what she was thinking. He didn't know what to do with any of this. He was a practical man who'd built a practical life. In this situation, a woman he'd known for less than 2 weeks, living in what had been his storage room, treating half the junction's workforce on an unofficial basis, was not something he'd planned for or prepared himself to handle. He managed by keeping the stove stocked and the coffee ready and not asking questions he didn't have a right to ask. The rumor arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a railroad conductor named Fillmore, who had a talent for remembering grievances that weren't his own. Fillmore had been through Mill Haven, knew a man there who knew Theodore Voss. And the story, in Fillmore's telling, was that a woman calling herself a healer had prescribed Theodore Voss a treatment that had done him real damage before a proper doctor came and set things right. It was a simple rumor, the efficient kind, because it contained just enough truth to be hard to dismiss and just enough omission to be genuinely unfair. By Wednesday morning, 2 of Evelyn's regular patients hadn't shown up. By Wednesday afternoon, a woman she'd been treating for 3 weeks sent her teenage son to say she wouldn't be needing any more visits. Evelyn heard it all from Declan's wife, Clara, who came by to relay the news with the grim directness of someone who thought Evelyn deserved to know the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. "People are scared," Clara said. "That's all it is. But scared people make decisions they're not proud of later." "I know," Evelyn said. "What are you going to do?" "What I always do," Evelyn said. "Keep working." Clara looked at her for a moment. "My mother-in-law said to thank you. Her hands are better." "I'm glad." "People in this town," Clara said, choosing her words carefully, "they take a while. But they're not stupid. They'll figure it out." After Clara left, Evelyn sat for a long time at the small table in her room. The truth about Theodore Voss was complicated, and complicated truths were easy to lose in small towns where people needed things simple. The truth was that Theodore had been deteriorating from something he'd hidden from her, a chronic condition he'd been too proud to admit, and that Evelyn's treatment had been correct for what he'd told her, not correct for what he'd concealed. Dr. Peterman, arriving later with the full picture that Theodore's wife had finally provided, had adjusted accordingly. She'd written to Peterman afterward. He'd written back. She had that letter. But she'd learned that letters didn't move faster than gossip, and gossip in a rail town moved at the speed of an express. She pulled out her journal and made her entries for the day. 2 patients seen, 1 follow-up scheduled, 3 canceled. She wrote it all down. Nathan didn't ask about the canceled appointments, but that evening, when she came into the kitchen for water, he was still at the table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and he said without looking up from the freight ledger he was pretending to read, "You don't have to explain anything to me." She stopped. "I wasn't planning to." "Good." He turned a page. "There's beef stew on the stove. Made too much." She stood there for a moment. "Nathan," she said. He looked up. "Why did you offer me the room?" she asked. "Actually, not the version you told me on the platform." He considered this with the same unhurried seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "Because Harlan Voss was performing," he said, "and you weren't." She waited to see if there was more. "And because I've spent 15 years working freight lines," he said, "and I've gotten pretty good at recognizing when something's being discarded because it's genuinely broken versus because it's inconvenient. You didn't look broken to me." She didn't say anything for a moment. "The stew," she said finally, "smells like it might actually be edible." "Don't oversell it," he said. "I cooked the same 4 things." She got a bowl. They didn't talk much more than that, but for the first time since she'd arrived in Redstone Junction, the silence in the room felt like something she could settle into, rather than something she had to defend herself against. The stew was, as Nathan had predicted, not remarkable, but it was hot and there was plenty of it, and Evelyn had eaten worse in better circumstances, so she didn't complain. What surprised her was that he ate standing at the counter while she sat at the table, not out of any deliberate rudeness, but because she gathered from the way he moved around his own kitchen, that was simply how he ate when he was alone. He'd been alone for long enough that the habits had calcified. She thought about saying something. She didn't. That was the beginning of a particular kind of arrangement between them, the kind that didn't have a name and didn't need one yet. They shared a kitchen and occasionally a table and conversation that was usually practical and sometimes not, and they were careful with each other in the way that 2 people are careful when they both understand that the situation is unusual and neither of them has a script for it. She paid her share when she had money. When she didn't, she fixed the flu damper he'd been fighting with for 2 winters, rebandaged his left hand where he'd torn it open on a freight hook and hadn't told anyone because he didn't want the fuss, and once spent 40 minutes talking him through what was wrong with his right knee before he admitted it had been bothering him since October. "Why didn't you see the station doctor?" she asked, pressing along the joint while he sat on a crate in the freight office with his jaw tight. "Peterman's been in and out," he said, "and it wasn't bad enough to bother with." "It's been bad enough since October," she said. "You've been favoring it. I noticed the second day." He looked at her. "You noticed." "I notice how people move," she said. "It's part of the work." He was quiet for a moment. "What's wrong with it?" "Inflammation. Probably been coming on for years. You need to stay off it when you can and stop pretending the cold doesn't make it worse." She sat back. "I can make a compress that'll help with the swelling." "I don't need—" "I'm making it," she said. "You can choose not to use it." He used it. She didn't say anything about that either. The thing about Nathan Cole that Evelyn was slowly working out was that he was not an easy man, not in the way that difficult men were difficult. He wasn't moody or demanding or unpredictable. He was private in a way that had clearly become structural, built up over years like the calluses on his hands, layer by layer, until the privacy was just part of him and he probably didn't notice it anymore. He'd been married once. She gathered this from small things: a second set of hooks by the door that held nothing, a quilt on the chair in the sitting room that didn't match anything else in the house, the way he sometimes started a sentence and stopped before the word "we" came out. She didn't ask. It wasn't her business, and she had enough of her own history she wasn't eager to explain. His name was Samuel. She found that out from Declan, who mentioned it once without thinking, that Nathan had had a son who died of fever 6 years ago, a boy of 12, and that Nathan's wife Margaret had left the following year because she said she couldn't stay in a town where everything reminded her. She'd gone back east to her family. Declan said it the way people say things they assume you already know, then caught himself. "Sorry," he said. "I figured—" "It's all right," Evelyn said. She filed it away quietly. It explained some things about the hooks by the door and the untouched quilt, and the way Nathan moved through his own house, like someone who'd learned to take up less space than he was entitled to. It also explained, she thought, why he hadn't hesitated on the platform. A man who has lost enough learns to recognize real loss in other people, even when it's dressed up in something as ordinary as a woman picking instruments off a frozen platform. She didn't think about that too much, but she didn't forget it either. The week after the Fillmore rumor, 3 more patients canceled. The infectious fear of association Evelyn knew from long experience moved faster than any actual infection. People who'd shaken her hand now found reasons to look elsewhere when she passed. The station agent, who'd been polite enough in the first few days, started giving her that particular sideways look that meant he'd heard something and was deciding what to do with it. She kept working. Declan's wife Clara kept coming and brought her mother-in-law, and quietly mentioned Evelyn's name to 2 women at the dry goods store. A railroad engineer named Garrett showed up one morning with a deep bruise across his ribs and a reluctance to explain how he'd gotten it, and Evelyn treated him without asking, and he left looking startled, like he'd expected something other than competence and discretion. Small victories. She counted them. What she didn't count, because counting them felt like tempting something, was the way Nathan's house had started to feel different to her. Not comfortable exactly. She'd trained herself out of comfort years ago, out of necessity, but inhabitable in a way that mattered. The stove was reliable, the room was quiet. The flu worked now, and there was someone at the kitchen table in the mornings who didn't expect her to be anything other than what she was. That, she understood, was rarer than it should have been. The second week of January brought a cold snap that was mean even by Redstone Junction standards. The kind of cold that finds every crack in the walls and makes the water in the wash basin skin over with ice by midnight. Evelyn added a second layer to her examination routine, checking frostbite on the workers who came in from outdoor shifts and reminding each one about keeping their feet dry, which they all said they knew and mostly didn't do. She was examining a young brakeman's fingers on a Wednesday morning when the side door opened without a knock, and she turned to find Harlan Voss filling the doorway. She'd known he was still in town. Declan had mentioned seeing him twice near the property office, and Nathan had said once, flat and without elaboration, that Voss had been in the freight office asking questions about shipping rates that didn't add up to any legitimate business Nathan could identify. But she hadn't expected him here, at her door, in the room that was, for the moment, as close to a clinic as she had. "Get out," the brakeman said immediately, because he was 22 and had more courage than calculation. "Easy," Evelyn said quietly, and the brakeman subsided. Voss looked around the room with the slow, evaluating look of someone pricing an estate sale. His eyes moved over the medical bag, the instruments on the dresser, the folding table she'd gotten Nathan to drag in from the freight office, the small shelf of medicines and supplies. His expression didn't change, but something in it sharpened. "Interesting setup," he said. "We're in the middle of an examination," Evelyn said. She didn't move from where she stood between Voss and her patient. "Unless you need medical attention, I'll ask you to come back later." "I don't need a doctor," he said. "Certainly not you." "Then you can wait outside." He didn't move. "I came to tell you something, woman to woman, or I suppose woman to whatever you are. There are people in this town who are going to start asking formal questions about your credentials, about what happened in Millhaven, about whether someone who isn't licensed under territorial law has any business treating patients for payment." "I'm aware of the licensing requirements," Evelyn said. "I'm also aware that territorial law makes provision for medical practitioners in areas where no licensed physician is permanently stationed." Something flickered across his face. He hadn't expected that. "Regardless," he said. "No," she said. "Not regardless. That's exactly the regard. If you have a formal complaint, there's a process for filing it. If you don't, you're standing in my examination room wasting my patient's time and mine." The brakeman let out a sound that was not quite a laugh and turned it quickly into a cough. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he'd expected from this visit, tears, retreat, some capitulation that would make his next move easier, he clearly wasn't getting it, and she could see him recalculating. "You've made an enemy you don't understand," he said finally. I imagine you say that to a lot of people, Evelyn replied. He left. The brakeman, his name was Toby, she remembered, exhaled loudly. Lord, who is that man? Someone who thinks inconvenience is the same as power, Evelyn said. Give me your other hand. She finished the examination. Toby's fingers were fine, just cold, and she sent him off with instructions about gloves and dry socks, and he went looking considerably cheerier than when he'd come in, which was its own small win. After he left, she sat down and took stock. The visit wasn't a surprise, not really. She'd known Voss wasn't done. Men like him were never done until they got what they wanted or they got stopped, and she didn't have the means to stop him, not formally. What she had was the knowledge, learned in too many towns over too many years, that men like Voss operated in the space between what was legal and what was provable, and the way you survived that was to be so clearly useful that the community itself became the shield. She was working on that. She just needed more time. She heard the freight yard whistle blow for shift change, and then 20 minutes later she heard Nathan's boots on the path outside. He knocked. He always knocked, even though it was his property. And she said, "Come in," and he stood in the doorway with his coat still on, looking at her with the expression that meant he'd already heard something. Toby Marsh came through the yard, he said. He's got good circulation, she said. The fingers were fine. Evelyn. His voice was level but carrying something underneath it. Voss was here. Yes. What did he say? She told him. Nathan listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd learned to rely on about him. He actually listened instead of formulating his response while she was still talking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The licensing provision you cited, he said. That's real? It's in the territorial statutes from 1874, she said. Section 12, I believe. I looked it up the second day I was here. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, more the precursor to one. You looked it up the second day, he said. I always look it up, she said. Every territory, every jurisdiction. It's the first thing I do. He nodded slowly. Then, I'm going to find out what Voss is actually doing in this town. That's your business, she said. It's yours too if he's coming to your door. She didn't have an argument for that. She also noticed that he'd said your door without any qualifiers. Not my house or the room, but your door. And she didn't know what to do with that exactly, but she registered it. Be careful, she said. He's not stupid. Neither am I, Nathan said. He left to make dinner, which that night was salt pork and boiled potatoes, and was, as she'd come to expect, functional rather than inspired. She ate it and didn't complain, and he refilled her coffee without asking, and neither of them said anything about Voss for the rest of the evening. Later, lying on the cot with the stove ticking as it cooled, she stared at the ceiling and thought about the word home. What it meant, whether it was a place or something else, whether it was something you carried or something you built. She'd spent 9 years treating it like something she'd already left behind her, a door she'd closed on the day she'd buried her husband, and realized that the house they'd shared was just walls now, just a structure, without the person who'd made it mean anything. She hadn't let herself think the word home since. She was careful not to think it now. She turned over and went to sleep. The cold snap held through the rest of January, and Evelyn's informal clinic grew in the careful underground way that things grow in small towns when people are too proud to admit they've changed their minds. They didn't announce themselves. They came early or late, when the platform traffic was low, when they could tell themselves they were just passing. A woman with a fever that had been building for a week. An old man with a chest complaint he'd been ignoring since autumn. A child with an ear infection that had kept the whole family awake for 6 days. She kept notes on every one of them. Dates, conditions, treatments, outcomes. It was the discipline that kept her honest and the record that protected her, because she'd learned that when men like Voss came looking for evidence of malpractice, documentation was the only thing that stood between an accusation and a verdict. Nathan found her at the table one evening, writing by lamplight, and said nothing, just put a cup of coffee near her elbow and went to his chair with his freight ledger. They stayed like that for 2 hours, not talking, just working, in the same warm room with the sound of the signal tower bell drifting in from the yard every 20 minutes and the wind working at the gaps in the siding. Evelyn wrote 12 entries. She was aware, in the back of her mind, of a particular quality to the silence between them that had nothing uncomfortable in it, and she was aware that this was something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, and she chose not to examine it too closely because examining things too closely was how you scared them away. What Nathan had found out about Harlan Voss, he told her in pieces, across a few evenings, the way careful people share information they're still working out the implications of. Voss had been through Redstone Junction twice before in the past 18 months. The property office on the main street had records of 2 transactions: a note bought on a failing dry goods store and a lien placed on a parcel of ranch land east of town when the owner, a widower named Gruber, had fallen behind on payments during a bad cattle year. Both transactions were legal. Both were the kind of legal that felt like something else. What Nathan had noticed, working freight for 15 years, was that Voss's shipments, the ones logged under the holding company name that appeared on the property documents, were moving east. Goods coming into the junction from the Western Territories, lots of them, more than you'd expect for a man whose stated business was buying and reselling debt. What kind of goods? Evelyn asked. Timber assessment reports, Nathan said, filed as business correspondence, but the freight agent who handled the first batch told me it was maps, survey maps. She looked at him. There's a rumor, he said carefully, that a timber company out of St. Louis has been eyeing the territory north of here. Big operation, the kind that buys up land cheap before the survey goes public and then sells it for 10 times the value once the railroad spur gets approved. And Voss is buying up debt so he can foreclose on the land before the survey becomes common knowledge, Evelyn said. That's what it looks like. She thought about this, about Gruber's ranch east of town, about the dry goods owner, about how many other people in Redstone Junction might be sitting on property that was worth 10 times what they owed on it without knowing it. We need proof, she said. Yes, Nathan said. We do. Though we went unremarked upon. It had started happening naturally, somewhere in the past 2 weeks, without either of them deciding to let it. She thought about what she'd have said if anyone had told her, standing on that platform with her instruments scattered across the frozen boards, that 3 weeks later she'd be sitting at this table, in this house, with this quiet and serious man, working out how to dismantle a scheme that was ruining people's lives. She'd have said they were out of their mind, but that was before she'd seen how Nathan Cole moved through the world, the deliberate, unflashy competence of him, the way he listened and observed and acted without needing anyone to notice. He was, she realized, the kind of man who did what was necessary without any apparent requirement to be recognized for it. She understood that. She'd built her whole life around that same principle. She wasn't sure what to do with the understanding. She wrote it in her journal that night, in the private shorthand she used for things she wanted to think about but not commit to fully. NC. Does what's necessary. Doesn't need credit. Rare. Then she closed the journal and blew out the lamp. 2 days later, the Fillmore rumor hit another wave. Fillmore himself had moved on down the line, but the story had taken root the way bad stories do in close quarters. It didn't need its original teller anymore. It was self-sustaining now, growing small extensions and additions as it passed from person to person. In the new versions, Theodore Voss's kidney infection became something more dramatic. The treatment Evelyn had given became more reckless. And the detail that everyone reached for, inevitably, was her age. She was 57, she'd been a widow for 9 years. She'd been wandering for most of those years without a permanent home or clinic. These were facts, and in the mouth of someone inclined to use them, they became a portrait of a woman who had failed at the settled life and was therefore unreliable. She heard it from Clara again, who had appointed herself Evelyn's reluctant intelligence officer in the way that warm-hearted women sometimes do when they've decided someone needs looking after. Mrs. Hollenbeck at the rooming house says you shouldn't be treating children, Clara said. She had the uncomfortable expression of a messenger who doesn't believe the message. Says it's not, I'm just telling you what's being said. Says it's not responsible, given your history. My history, Evelyn said. The Millhaven thing. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The child she'd treated in Millhaven, the one who'd survived scarlet fever when no one thought she would, had a name. Emma Louise. She was 7 years old now, and the last time Evelyn had heard, entirely well and causing her parents the normal amount of trouble that healthy 7-year-olds cause. Does Mrs. Hollenbeck have children herself? Evelyn asked. 4, Clara said. Why? If any of them need a doctor, Evelyn said, the offer stands. Clara stared at her. You'd treat the children of someone who's spreading rumors about you? I'd treat anyone who was sick, Evelyn said. That's not sainthood, Clara. It's just the work. Clara shook her head slowly. You're a strange woman, Evelyn. So I've been told. That evening, a boy arrived at the side door. 12 years old, out of breath, with the specific panic of a child who's been sent alone on an urgent errand. His name was James, he said, and his mother was sick, and she told him to go to the healing lady at the coal house. Evelyn got her bag. The mother was a woman named Ruth Ainsley, 34, who lived in one of the railroad worker cottages near the eastern yard. She was 4 months pregnant with her third child and had been running a fever for 2 days that she'd been hiding from everyone, including her husband, who was out on a freight run and wouldn't be back until Thursday. Her 2 older children, James, 12, and a girl of 9 named Bia, stood in the kitchen doorway watching with the terrible quiet of children who have learned that the worst thing they can do when something is wrong is be loud about it. Evelyn worked methodically. The fever wasn't as bad as it might have been, caught early enough to manage without the complications she'd feared when she first walked in. She stayed for 2 hours, made sure Ruth's temperature was coming down, ate a bowl of soup she didn't need because refusing it would have made the children feel worse, and explained clearly and without drama what Ruth needed to do over the next several days. You should have sent for me 2 days ago, Evelyn said. I didn't want to. I'd heard the things people were saying, Ruth said. She had the grace to look ashamed. I know, Evelyn said, but you have children, Mrs. Ainsley. That changes the calculation. Ruth nodded, eyes red. James, Evelyn said, turning to the boy in the doorway. You did exactly right coming to get me. You can be proud of that. He stood straighter in a way that made her chest ache a little, because he was exactly the age Samuel Cole would have been if Samuel Cole had lived, and she knew without anyone telling her that Nathan still counted those years. She walked home in the dark, cold down to her bones, and found Nathan waiting on the step outside his door. Long night? He said. Railroad family, she said. Husband's out on the line. Wife and 2 children. She'd been sick 2 days before she sent the boy. He was quiet for a moment. She's going to be all right? If she does what I said. Evelyn stopped at her own door. How old was he? Samuel? The silence that followed was a particular kind. Not heard exactly, but something that had been pressed on. 12, Nathan said. Almost 13. I thought so, she said. There's a boy at the Ainsley house about that age. He had the same look. She unlocked her door. I'm sorry, for what it's worth. It's worth something, he said. His voice was even, but just barely. She went inside. She didn't sleep for a long time. The world outside the small window above her cot was dark and cold and full of the iron sounds of the railway yard, and somewhere in the station a train was arriving, the headlamp throwing light across the snow-covered tracks, and she lay there and thought about how strange it was, how genuinely, unexpectedly strange, that after 9 years of moving from town to town, from one borrowed room to the next, she had ended up here, in this specific house, next to this specific yard, and that the thing she kept coming back to when she thought about the morning she'd be willing to leave was that she didn't particularly want to. That scared her, a little. She was 57 years old, and she knew better than to put weight on something that might not hold. But it was there. She couldn't pretend it wasn't. She turned over, pulled the quilt up, and listened to the train until it stopped. By the first week of February, Redstone Junction had settled into its uneasy double opinion of Evelyn Harper. Half the town had decided she was probably fine. The other half maintained that the situation was irregular and therefore suspicious. Both halves, in a crisis, came to the side door of Nathan Cole's house. She had learned by now which patients were most likely to arrive after dark, when they could pretend they hadn't come on purpose. She'd learned that the station agent, whose sideways looks had never quite resolved into courtesy, had a daughter at the seminary in Callaway who sent him a letter every Sunday, and that on the days those letters didn't arrive, he was shorter-tempered than usual. She'd learned that the Redstone Junction telegraph operator, a man named Birch, knew everything that moved along the wire between here and the capital, and that he was constitutionally incapable of not sharing it. From Birch, who came in one afternoon for a stiff neck that he claimed was from the operator's chair, she learned that someone had filed a formal inquiry with the Territorial Medical Board about an unlicensed practitioner operating in Redstone Junction. The inquiry came in from a holding company name, Birch said, with the tone of a man who knows he's delivering news. Voss Holdings, I believe. Evelyn Swats continued wrapping his neck compress without a pause. When? She asked. Last week. Response could take a month, could take 3. Depends on the board's backlog. All right, she said. All right? Birch turned his head and she repositioned it firmly. That's all you've got to say? What would you like me to say? Most people would be worried, he said. I am worried, she said. I'm also rewrapping this compress because you moved. Hold still. She was worried. She was also, underneath the worry, something else. Something that felt like the particular quality of anger that comes from being very tired of fighting battles you didn't start. She had documentation. She had the territorial statute. She had the records of every patient she'd seen since arriving in Redstone Junction, with names and conditions and outcomes, and she had the letter from Dr. Peterman in Millhaven that clarified in medical terms exactly what had happened with Theodore Voss and what hadn't. What she didn't have was time, because a formal inquiry, even one that ultimately cleared her, could take months, and if Voss moved on the property scheme before that, if Gruber lost his ranch, if the dry goods owner lost his store, if others she hadn't even identified yet lost what they'd spent their lives building, then whatever she'd managed to document wouldn't matter at all. She needed the inquiry to go the other way. She needed Voss exposed before he could finish what he'd started. She thought about this all afternoon, and that evening she went to Nathan's table without being asked and said, I need to write some letters. He looked up from his ledger. I need to write to Dr. Peterman, she said, and I need to write to the Territorial Medical Board, and I need your help figuring out who in the property office might be willing to talk about what Voss has been filing. He closed the ledger. All right, he said. Tell me what you need. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow against the window in irregular gusts, and the signal tower bell was swinging without stopping, which meant a storm somewhere to the west was moving this way. Neither of them thought much about it yet. They were too busy writing. The letters went out on a Thursday, on the eastbound morning train, tucked into the leather mail pouch that Birch handled with the careful reverence of a man who understood that paper moved the world. Evelyn watched the train pull out from the platform and told herself not to count on anything. Letters to territorial boards arrived in piles and sat in piles, and were read when someone had time, and the board in question was a 3-man panel that met quarterly in a city 300 miles east of Redstone Junction, and had, in her experience, no particular urgency about the problems of small rail towns. She walked back to Nathan's house and saw patients for the rest of the morning. What she had not told Nathan, because she hadn't fully worked out what to do with it yet, was the second letter she'd written, the one that hadn't gone in the official mail pouch, the one she'd addressed, in careful handwriting on plain stationery, to a man named Elias Drum in the Territorial Land Office in Carson City, a man she'd treated for a badly broken wrist 7 years ago in a settlement called Pryor's Crossing, who had told her afterward, with the particular sincerity of a man who's just had his wrist set without screaming, that if she ever needed anything from anyone in land administration, she should write. She'd never written. She wrote now. She didn't tell him everything. She told him enough. A man named Harlan Voss, operating under a holding company, buying up debt on properties in Redstone Junction, possibly in possession of survey maps that hadn't been made public, possibly in coordination with a timber interest out of St. Louis. She asked him, as carefully as she knew how to ask, whether any of that triggered anything he might be able to look into quietly. She sealed the letter and gave it to Birch directly, outside the wire office, and asked him to send it by personal courier rather than mail, which cost her $2 she didn't have to spare. Birch looked at the address. Land office, he said. Personal correspondence, Evelyn said. He looked at her in the way he was starting to look at her, like she was more interesting than he'd originally calculated. Personal correspondence, he agreed, and pocketed the envelope. She walked back to the house and made coffee and didn't tell Nathan about Elias Drum. Not because she was keeping secrets, because she'd spent 30 years solving problems by herself, and the habit of not counting on anyone until they'd actually come through was one she couldn't shake just because she was sharing a kitchen now. The storm that had been building to the west since the week before arrived on a Saturday night with no particular warning, the way serious weather often does. 1 hour the wind was cold and steady, and the next hour there was no sky visible at all, just white pressing in from every direction at once, and the temperature dropping so fast that the water left in the basin outside the freight office froze in less than an hour. By Sunday morning, the tracks east and west were buried. The telegraph was down. The road to Callaway, which was already bad, was completely impassable, which meant Dr. Peterman, who had finally been making his way back from a long absence, was stranded somewhere on the far side of 40 miles of drifted snow, unreachable until the storm broke. What nobody had fully accounted for was the number of people stranded inside Redstone Junction itself. There were 2 trains that had pulled in late Saturday before the tracks became impassable. An eastbound passenger train and a westbound freight with 3 crew cars attached. And the combined overflow of passengers and railroad workers had filled the station waiting room, the freight office, and both hotels past capacity within 2 hours. People were sleeping on benches, on floors, in the station baggage room. Children were crying. A woman had gone into labor on the passenger train before it fully stopped, and had been carried into the station on a luggage cart. Nathan was at the station by 5 in the morning. He found Evelyn already there. "When did you get here?" "Yes," he said. 4:30, she said. She was moving through the waiting room in her coat, still buttoned, doing a fast visual assessment of everyone present the way she did when she walked into any room. Reading, sorting, prioritizing. "There's a woman in labor in the station master's office. 3 cases of fever I've identified so far. 2 children and 1 older man. 6 frostbite presentations, 2 of which need immediate attention. And there are at least 40 people in this building with no warm food and no idea how long they're going to be here." Nathan looked around the crowded waiting room. The station's coal stove was working but inadequate for this many people. The smell of wet wool and closed space and anxiety was already thick. "The freight office," he said. "It's bigger. Better stove, 2 of them." "That's what I was thinking. I'll get it open and get the stoves going. Can you—" "Already started," she said, and moved toward the station master's office. He watched her go for a moment, just a moment, and then turned and started giving orders. The next 3 days were the kind that compress time strangely, where individual hours feel endless, and the whole thing afterward is difficult to reconstruct in sequence. What Evelyn could remember later was not an orderly narrative, but a series of moments that were, each of them, the only thing that existed while they were happening. The woman in labor, her name was Frances, she was 28, and her husband was somewhere on the western freight car that had been separated from the main consist before the tracks became fully buried, was frightened in a very quiet way, the kind of frightened that had decided not to be loud about itself. She was strong, and she was scared, and she was doing both at once, which Evelyn recognized as one of the harder combinations to sustain. "First?" Evelyn asked. "Second," Frances said. "First was fast. My mother said that means this one will be too." "Your mother was right about some things," Evelyn said. "Let's not commit to this being one of them." Frances almost laughed, which was what Evelyn had intended. It took 4 hours. It was not fast, and it was not without complications. The cord was presenting awkwardly, and Evelyn had to work in a way she hadn't had to work in some time, focused entirely, with 2 railroad workers' wives she'd conscripted as assistants holding lamps and following her instructions with the focused fear of people who very much want to be helpful and are terrified of doing something wrong. Nathan came to the door once, partway through. He looked at the situation, looked at Evelyn, and said, "What do you need?" "More hot water," she said, "and someone to find Frances's husband." "Working on both," he said, and left. The baby arrived at 11 in the morning, a girl, smaller than ideal, but breathing on her own within 20 seconds, which was the only number Evelyn was counting. Frances made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, and held the baby with the particular grip of someone who hadn't been sure they were going to get to do this. "Does she have a name?" one of the assistants asked. "I don't know yet," Frances said. We thought we had more time." You've got time now, Evelyn said. She stayed long enough to make sure both of them were stable, then went to find the next problem. There were several. The older man with fever, a traveler named Hofstede, 63, who'd been on the passenger train and had been coughing since before the storm, was worse than she'd initially assessed. His lungs were in trouble. She moved him to a corner of the freight office that she'd claimed as a makeshift examination area, separated from the general population by a stack of freight crates, and spent an hour working on him with the limited tools she had and the frank knowledge that what he really needed was a hospital bed and a proper physician, and that neither of those things was available. She stabilized him. She couldn't cure him, not here, not with what she had. She told him this clearly because he was the kind of man who seemed to want the truth more than comfort. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough that you need a real facility when the storm breaks. Good enough that you'll get there if you rest and don't push yourself." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to tell you there's nothing to worry about, Mr. Hofstede. There is. But the worry is for later. Right now your job is to stay warm and breathe slowly and let the medicine do its work." He nodded. He was scared. He didn't pretend he wasn't, which she respected. The children with fever were more straightforward, a classic cold weather lung complaint in both cases, the kind she'd treated dozens of times, and both of them were young enough and otherwise healthy enough that the risk was manageable. She gave their mothers instructions and reassurance in equal measure and moved on. The frostbite cases were Declan's domain as much as hers. He'd shown up at the freight office at 6 in the morning with his wife Clara and 3 other women from the rail worker cottages, and without anyone specifically asking him to, he'd organized a rotation for hot food distribution and blanket allocation that was working better than anything official. Clara had also, Evelyn noticed, quietly identified 2 women among the stranded passengers who were nurses, one retired Army, one from a hospital in Denver, and brought them both to Evelyn without ceremony. "I figured you could use the help," Clara said. "I absolutely can," Evelyn said. "Thank you." The retired Army nurse, whose name was Marguerite, and who was in her 60s and had a brisk, no-nonsense quality that Evelyn found immediately restoring, looked around the makeshift clinic and said, "What's the triage order? Fever cases first, then frostbite, then general complaints? There's a new mother and infant in the station master's office who need monitoring every 2 hours." "Got it," Marguerite said, and that was that. It rained, and then it sleeted, and then it did something that was a combination of both, and the temperature outside dropped to what the station thermometer read as 17 degrees, which was the last reading anyone took, because after that the thermometer was encased in ice and unreadable. Inside the freight office, 90-some people organized themselves into the practical communities that humans form under sufficient pressure. The women with children clustering together, the railroad workers rotating in shifts to keep the stoves supplied, and the structural concerns monitored. The older men who couldn't do heavy lifting, finding other ways to be useful, keeping watch on the sick, talking to the frightened. Nathan moved through it all like a man who had been designed for exactly this, not in the romantic sense, but in the specific, practical sense that he knew every inch of this building and every person in his crew and exactly how much coal there was and where the backup supplies were stored and how long they would last under current conditions. He was not inspiring. He was competent, which was better. Inspiration fades. Competence is what keeps people warm. Evelyn watched him in the moments she had to watch anything and thought about what it would have been like to know him 20 years ago. Then she stopped thinking about it and went back to work, because there was always more work. On the second day, the thing she'd been quietly dreading happened. Harlan Voss found her. He'd been in Redstone Junction when the storm hit and had not, as far as she could tell, made any particular effort to be useful during the crisis. He'd secured himself a room at the first hotel and stayed there through the first day. But on the second day, he appeared in the freight office with his coat on and his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has decided to observe things and is making sure everyone notices that he's observing them. He watched Evelyn work for 20 minutes without saying anything. She was aware of him. She kept working. Then he came up behind her. She was wrapping a railroad worker's badly frostbitten foot and didn't turn around and said, "Still practicing without a license." "Still standing in other people's space," she replied, without pausing. "Hold this," she said to the worker, who took the bandage end with the faint embarrassment of a large man being told what to do by a woman half his size. The inquiry I filed will be reviewed in March, Voss said. I've had confirmation. Good, she said. I'll send my documentation directly to the board. Your documentation. He said it lightly, like it was something she'd invented. Every patient I've treated in Redstone Junction, she said. Dates, conditions, treatments, outcomes. It's all recorded. She tied off the bandage and looked up at Voss for the first time. How's your cousin Theodore, Mr. Voss? Something twitched in his expression. I've also written to Dr. Peterman in Callaway, she said. He sent a letter to the board clarifying the circumstances of Theodore's case. I expect it arrived before mine did. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. You've been busy, Voss said. I've been working, she said. They're not the same thing. You might consider the distinction. She turned back to her patient and heard Voss walk away, and she took one slow breath and let it out and did not allow herself to feel good about the exchange yet. Because a man who'd just been outmaneuvered in an argument was frequently at his most dangerous in the following hours. She was right about that. What Voss did next, what she found out about 2 hours later from Birch, who had been watching from near the coal stoves, was that he went to 3 of the stranded passengers, men who looked prosperous and settled, and spoke to them privately in a corner of the waiting area. Birch couldn't hear the specific words, but he could see the men's expressions changing, and he could see Voss's hands moving with the particular deliberateness of someone presenting information he wants to look like it's just coming up naturally in conversation. He's telling them about Millhaven, Birch said, laying groundwork for when the storm breaks, probably wanting to have witnesses who'll say they heard about the problem before any investigation concluded. Evelyn listened to this and thought about it carefully. All right, she said. All right, Birch repeated in the tone he'd developed for her habit of responding to difficult news with composure. What does all right mean this time? It means I understand what he's doing, she said, and I know what I need to do in response. I just haven't fully worked out how. Tell Cole, Birch said. She looked at him. I know you don't like asking for help, Birch said, with the unvarnished bluntness of a man who spends his days receiving and transmitting other people's unfiltered words. I've noticed. I've been watching you not ask for help for 3 weeks, but Cole has connections in the junction that you don't have yet, and this Voss situation is getting complicated enough that 2 heads are better. She wanted to say something about minding his own business. She found she couldn't quite say it, because he wasn't wrong. Fine, she said. She found Nathan in the freight loading bay talking with 2 of his crew supervisors about the structural integrity of the roof under the ice load. He looked over when she appeared in the doorway, read her expression, and excused himself from the conversation without making a point of it. What? He said. She told him. All of it, including Elias Drum at the land office, which she hadn't told him before. He listened. He didn't say anything about the part she'd withheld, though she could see him register it, just a slight shift in his expression, quickly reset. Drum is a good contact, he said. Do you know if he received the letter? No way to know until the telegraph is back up. Nathan nodded. He was thinking in that quiet, methodical way she'd come to recognize him, turning the problem, looking at the angles, not speaking until he'd worked something out. There's a man here, he said. Stranded passenger. Name of Aldous Webb. He works for the Territorial Attorney General's office in Carson City. I've moved freight for that office 3 times in the past 2 years. He paused. He's in the waiting room. Evelyn looked at him. And if Voss is operating a land fraud scheme in this territory, Nathan said, then what Voss is doing is not just a civil matter. It's criminal. And if someone from the Territorial Attorney General's office were to hear, informally, some of what you've put together, the survey maps, the holding company, the timing of the debt purchases. You want to talk to him, she said. I want to introduce you to him, Nathan said. What you say is up to you. She thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. Where is he? Aldous Webb was a slight man in his late 40s with the careful eyes and non-committal manner of someone who had spent a career listening for what people weren't saying. He was sitting near the far stove with a cup of something hot and a look of a man who had resigned himself to being stuck and was making the best of it. Nathan introduced them with minimal preamble. Webb looked at Evelyn with the polite attention of a man who wasn't sure yet why he was being introduced to this particular person. "Nathan tells me you run freight," Webb said. "I run freight," Nathan confirmed. "Mrs. Harper treats patients. She's also spent the last 3 weeks building a picture of something that I think you might find professionally interesting." Webb glanced between them. "What kind of picture?" Evelyn sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. There were no chairs to pull up. She simply sat on a crate and told him what she knew about Harlan Voss, in the same organized, evidence-first manner she used when presenting a clinical case. Not dramatized, not inflated, just the sequence of facts in the order they connected. Webb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The survey maps," he said. "Do you have documentation of those specifically?" "Nathan does," she said. "Freight records showing the shipments under the Voss Holdings name. The freight agent who handled the first batch identified the contents as maps." "Would the freight agent testify to that?" Nathan said, "Probably, if it were formal." "And the debt purchases are on record at the property office?" "Publicly registered," Nathan said. "I pulled the documents myself." Webb set down his cup. He had the expression of a man who had been handed something he needed to think about carefully before he committed to a position. "I want to be clear," he said. "I can't promise anything right now. This isn't my county, and an investigation would need to be authorized by the Attorney General directly. What I can do," he paused, weighing it, "is carry this information back personally, and I can speak to the right people about how it should be prioritized." "That's all we're asking," Nathan said. Webb nodded. Then he looked at Evelyn. "The medical inquiry. The one Voss filed." "March," she said. "I'll mention it when I talk to the right people," he said. "A man who files a formal medical complaint to pressure a witness in an ongoing matter. That's worth noting." Evelyn felt something ease, very slightly, in the back of her chest. She hadn't allowed herself to feel anything about the medical inquiry since Birch had told her about it. She'd put it in the category of things she could document but not control, and she'd filed it there and kept moving. But hearing someone with authority say, in plain terms, that it was worth noting, that the pattern of it was recognizable and meaningful, was something different. "Thank you," she said. She meant it simply. Webb nodded. "Thank you for building the case rather than just making accusations." She didn't say anything to that. Nathan caught her eye briefly, and she looked away. On the second night, the storm shifted. Not broke. That would take another full day, but shifted, the wind changing direction enough that the worst of the pressure on the building eased, and the temperature outside climbed marginally above zero, which felt, to everyone inside the freight office who'd been living at the mercy of 17 below, like a genuine reprieve. Marguerite found Evelyn sitting against the wall near the back of the clinic area at 2 a.m, eating half a biscuit and staring at nothing. "When did you last sleep?" Marguerite asked. "I slept a little," Evelyn said. "That's not an answer." "I know." Marguerite sat down beside her on the freight floor, which was something Evelyn respected. The retired Army nurse had as much right as anyone to a cot, and she'd given hers to a stranded passenger with children. "The Hofstede man is stable," Marguerite said. "I checked him an hour ago. Fever's down a full degree." "Good. Francis and the baby are both doing well. The baby nursed for the first time about an hour ago. Strong." "Good," Evelyn said again, and felt a small, genuine warmth at that. She'd been checking on them between patients, and it had been one of the reliable pieces of good news in an otherwise difficult 2 days. "The 2 Fever children are both improving," Marguerite continued. "Mrs. Ainsley's husband found her this afternoon. He'd been on one of the work crews shoveling the eastern approach, and didn't know she was here until Declan told him. She cried for about 15 minutes and then went to sleep." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. "You built all this," Marguerite said. "This clinic, in 3 days, with crates and lamps in your own bag." "We built it," Evelyn said. "Nathan opened the building and organized the stoves and found the supplies and the crew. Clara and Declan organized the food and the blankets. You and the nurse from Denver handled half the cases. You just ran it," Marguerite said. Evelyn didn't argue. She ate the rest of the biscuit. "How long have you been doing this?" Marguerite asked. "Wandering, I mean, Moving from town to town. 9 years since my husband died. Where before that? Sacramento. We had a practice together. He was the physician of record. I was the one who saw most of the patients, but it was his name on the door because that was how it worked. She paused. When he died, the practice went to a colleague he'd partnered with. I had nowhere to go and nothing registered in my own name, so I went. Marguerite was quiet for a moment. I know how that goes, she said. Different circumstances, but I know how it goes. They sat together in the relative quiet of the middle of the night, the stoves working steadily, the sound of people sleeping all around them, and outside the incremental, grudging retreat of the worst storm Redstone Junction had seen in a decade. That man, Marguerite said. Cole. Evelyn didn't say anything. He checks on you, Marguerite said. Not on the clinic, on you specifically. Every time I've seen him come through, he looks at you first. He's thorough, Evelyn said. He looks at everything. Marguerite said, in the tone of someone deciding not to argue a point they've already won. Evelyn got up, because if she stayed on the floor any longer, she'd actually fall asleep on it. And sleeping on freight office floors at 57 was the kind of thing that stayed in your joints for a week. She did one more round of the clinic space, checking each patient in turn, making notes in the small journal she'd been carrying in her coat pocket because the one on the dresser at Nathan's house was inaccessible and she wasn't going to let the records lapse. Not now. Every name, every condition, every treatment, every change. 41 entries in 2 days. Hofstede was sleeping. She checked his temperature with her hand and the lines of his breathing and was satisfied. Francis was awake, nursing the baby in the corner of the station master's office where they'd put up a curtain for privacy. Does she have a name yet? Evelyn asked quietly. Francis looked down at the baby with an expression that was very simple and very tired and entirely content. I'm thinking Evelyn, she said. If that's all right with you. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment. It's a perfectly serviceable name, she said, which was not at all what she felt, but what she felt was too large for the middle of a crisis, and she put it away carefully to look at later. She was doing that a lot lately. Putting things away to look at later. She went back out into the freight office and found Nathan standing near the main stove with 2 cups of coffee, watching the room with the patient, steady attention of a man who doesn't need sleep the way other people do, or at least has learned to pretend that he doesn't. He handed her one of the cups without asking. Francis named the baby, she said. What did she go with? Evelyn looked into her coffee. Evelyn? He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her. That's something, he said. Yes, she said. It is. They stood by the stove together as the storm outside shifted again. A perceptible change in the quality of the wind, less angry, the pressure easing. And somewhere to the east, though none of them could know it yet, the sky was beginning to clear. The sky cleared on a Wednesday morning, not dramatically, but incrementally, the way the sky clears after a serious storm. First a thinning of the white, then a gray that wasn't quite as heavy, then a pale cold blue appearing in the southwest and spreading slowly east like something cautious about committing to itself. Nathan was on the platform at first light with 6 of his crew, assessing the tracks. The snow was deep, but the drifting pattern was workable. The worst accumulation was on the eastern approach, which could be cleared in 4 to 5 hours of sustained work with the right equipment. He sent 2 men to the equipment shed and walked the length of the platform himself, boot deep in snow, making calculations in his head about crew rotation and timing and which sections to prioritize. He was doing this because it was his job and because it needed doing, and also because physical work after 3 days of sustained crisis was the only reliable way he knew to clear his head. His head needed clearing. He hadn't said anything to Evelyn. He wasn't sure yet what he would say or how he'd say it, or whether it was the right time to say anything at all. What he knew, with the kind of certainty that came from paying close attention over a long period, was that the last 3 days had changed something in him that he didn't think was going to change back. He'd watched her work through a blizzard for 3 consecutive days with limited supplies, 2 borrowed assistants, and a makeshift clinic that was mostly just a corner of a freight building with good intentions. He'd watched her treat a dying man and a newborn baby and frightened children and frostbitten railroad workers with the same quality of focused, undramatic attention. He'd watched her eat half a biscuit at 2 in the morning and sit against a wall and still be on her feet an hour later. He'd watched all of it and understood, with the slow and uncomfortable clarity of a man who doesn't lie to himself even when it would be easier, that he was not simply looking at someone who was good at her work. He was looking at someone he didn't want to be without. That was the thing he needed to clear his head about, and walking the snow-packed platform in the early morning cold was not, it turned out, making it any clearer. He went back to work. By 10 in the morning, the first eastern section of track was clear enough to attempt, and Nathan sent the assessment wire to the junction control office, which had been dark for 3 days and came back to life with a burst of traffic that kept Birch occupied for 2 solid hours. The westbound line was worse. A drift had buried a full section of track under 6 feet of packed snow, but the eastbound could be operational by afternoon. The stranded passengers heard this, and the mood in the freight office shifted perceptibly. Not celebration exactly, because people were too tired and stiff and hungry for celebration, but something like the release of a breath that had been held for 3 days. Evelyn heard it from Marguerite, who came to find her in the station master's office, where she was doing a final check on Francis and the baby before the morning passengers could start thinking about departure. "Eastbound line is almost clear," Marguerite said. "Train should be able to move by afternoon." "Francis needs at least another day before she travels," Evelyn said, without looking up from the baby's color. "I'll tell her." "Tell her husband, too. He'll want to push for early departure, and she'll let him, because she's been through 3 days of this, and she wants to go home. Someone needs to be the one to say wait." "I'll be the one," Marguerite said, in the tone she'd developed over 60-some years of being the one. Francis, who had been awake and listening, said from the cot, "I'm right here." "I know," Evelyn said, "and you're doing beautifully. But beautiful doesn't mean ready to travel with a 2-day-old infant in February on an unheated train." Frances looked at her baby and then back at Evelyn with the expression of a woman who is genuinely uncertain whether to be grateful or irritated. "Fine," she said. "1 more day." "Good," Evelyn said. She did the rest of her rounds. Hofstede was improving and would be stable enough to travel the following day, with strict instructions that she wrote out by hand on 2 pages of her journal and tore out for him to keep. The fever children were both functionally recovered. The frostbite cases were all manageable with proper follow-up. She signed off on each assessment, packed her bag, and walked out of the freight office into the cold morning air. The platform was busy with crew and passengers emerging from 3 days of confinement, blinking in the pale sunlight like people remembering that the world outside the building still existed. Harlan Voss was on the platform. He was standing near the eastern end, bag in hand, watching the track crew work. He had the look of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at a decision, and when he saw Evelyn cross the platform, he turned toward her with a directness that she recognized as the kind that precedes a particular kind of conversation. She didn't slow her pace. "Mrs. Harper," he said. She stopped, not because she wanted to, but because turning away from Voss in a public space had never served her, and she didn't think it would start serving her now. "Mr. Voss." He looked, she noticed, slightly less composed than he had been a week ago. Not much, but the storm had not been comfortable for him, and 3 days in a hotel room without the ability to move his plans forward had done something to the surface polish of him. "I've been thinking," he said. "I imagine so," she said. "The inquiry." He paused, in the way of a man who wants to seem like he's choosing his words carefully when he's actually delivering something scripted. "I may have been hasty. Given what's happened here in the last few days, perhaps it would be appropriate to withdraw it." Evelyn looked at him. She understood what this was. She'd spent enough years dealing with men who operated in the flexible middle ground between law and advantage to recognize a tactical retreat. Voss had talked to the right people in the freight office during the storm, watched the room, figured out that Aldous Webb was there and was listening, and had done the math on what that might mean for his operations in Redstone Junction. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. "But the inquiry is a formal matter. Withdrawing it is between you and the medical board." "Of course," he said. I'd hoped for a more productive conversation than the one we've had so far." "I don't think we've had a conversation, Mr. Voss. I think you've made a series of statements, and I've responded to them." He looked at her. Something in his expression tried to reset toward conciliation and didn't quite get there. There's no need for this to become more complicated than it is, he said. She looked at him steadily. My work here is straightforward. I treat patients. I keep records. I operate within the bounds of the law. If that's complicated for you, I'd suggest the complication isn't coming from my direction. He opened his mouth and closed it. She said, Safe travels, Mr. Voss. She walked away and didn't look back, and she did not allow herself to feel good about it yet, because feeling good about it would mean she'd stopped watching, and she couldn't afford to stop watching. She found Nathan in the freight office reconciling supply inventories with two of his crew and waited until he looked up. Voss just tried to be reasonable, she said. Nathan straightened. How reasonable? Offered to withdraw the inquiry, framed it as extending an olive branch. Webb, Nathan said immediately. That's what I think. Nathan handed the inventory sheet back to his crew supervisor and said, Give me 20 minutes. And the supervisor took the sheet without comment and went away. He's worried, Nathan said. Yes, but worried men are not the same as stopped men. He still has the debt on Gruber's ranch and whatever else he's been accumulating. Withdrawing the inquiry doesn't change what he's been doing. Did you tell him that? Not in those words. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Webb leaves on the afternoon train. I know. I want to make sure he has everything he needs before he goes. All the documentation, the freight records, the property office filings, your notes on the timing. I have copies of everything, Evelyn said. In the journal. He nodded. Then he said, You've been awake for most of 3 days. I slept some. Evelyn. She looked at him. It was the same tone he'd used a week ago when he'd told her she didn't have to explain anything to him. That flat, simple honesty that didn't leave room for deflection. I'm tired, she admitted. I'll sleep tonight. You'll sleep this afternoon, he said. Webb's train doesn't leave until 3. I'll handle getting everything to him. You've built the case. Let me carry it to the platform. She wanted to argue. She could feel the argument forming. She'd been handling her own battles for 9 years. She didn't need someone to carry things for her. She was perfectly capable. She was also, she acknowledged privately, exhausted in a way that had gone past the ordinary and into the structural. The kind of tired where your hands weren't quite steady and your thoughts were taking a half-second longer than usual to arrive. All right, she said. Something moved in his expression. Relief, maybe, or surprise. She couldn't always read him yet, and yet was a word she noticed herself using about Nathan Cole more and more. Go, he said. I'll bring copies of the freight logs. You leave the journal with me before you go. She pulled the journal from her coat pocket and held it out. He took it with both hands, the way you take something that matters. She went back to the house and slept for 5 hours without moving. She woke to the sound of a train whistle, the eastbound line, finally operational, pulling out of the station, and lay still for a moment, taking stock of herself. The exhaustion had shifted into something more manageable. Her hands were steady, the back of her neck still ached, but that was from 3 days of leaning over patients and no compress was going to fix it quickly. She got up and put the kettle on, and Nathan came back at 5, carrying the freight logs and her journal and a look that meant he had things to tell her. Webb took everything, he said, setting the logs on the table. Spent 20 minutes going through the property records I'd pulled and the freight documentation. He has it all. Did he commit to anything? He said he'd make it a priority when he got back to Carson City. That an active scheme of this scale, with documentation this organized, was exactly the kind of case the Attorney General's office looked for. Nathan sat down across from her. He also said the inquiry Voss filed looks different now than it did this morning. Different how? He said, his words, that filing a formal medical complaint against a witness to a fraud scheme, when that complaint is filed by the party being investigated, constitutes potential obstruction. He's noting it in his report. Evelyn put her cup down. He used the word obstruction, she said. He used the word potential, Nathan said. He's a careful man. Even potential obstruction changes the character of the inquiry, she said. The board doesn't want to be seen validating a complaint that may be legally tainted. That's what I understood from what he was saying, yes. She sat with this for a moment. She was trying not to feel relieved yet, because relieved meant you'd let your guard down and she'd made that mistake before. But something had shifted tonight. She could feel it in the way that things shift when the weight of them changes without the circumstances changing entirely. Nathan, she said. When you went to find the journal pages I needed for Webb, the section on the property timing. She paused. You read the whole thing, didn't you? He looked at her, not caught exactly, more like a man who'd been wondering when the question would come. Some of it, he said. The personal sections. I wasn't looking for those, he said. I was looking for the property records. Some of the other sections came before them. She nodded. The journal was organized chronologically, not by subject. She knew what he would have found. The entry about Sacramento, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Your husband's practice. Yes. She looked at her coffee. Then you know more than I've told you. Some of it, he said again. Evelyn, you don't have to. His name was Robert, she said. We were married for 22 years. The practice was his in name only by the end. I was running most of it. Not that the colleagues knew that or particularly wanted to. She picked up the cup and put it down without drinking. When he died, I thought I had a plan. I thought I could petition the medical board to transfer the license registration. It took me 6 months to understand that wasn't going to happen the way I'd believed it would. The colleague, Nathan said, careful, not pressing. He was a good man, she said. I want to be fair about it. He wasn't malicious. He had a family and debts, and the practice represented security, and there were legal mechanisms that made what happened straightforward from a documentation standpoint. I wasn't the spouse of record on anything that mattered. She said it plainly, without the protective distance that comes from having told a story too many times to still feel it. Nathan heard that, she thought. He heard the difference. So you went, he said. I went, she said, wherever there were people who needed what I could do and no one else there to do it. It's a good way to be useful. It's a lonely way to live. The word lonely sat in the air between them for a moment. She hadn't intended to say it, not quite that directly, but there it was. Nathan looked at his hands on the table. I know something about that, he said. The lonely part. I know you do, she said. She hadn't planned the next part either. It just arrived, the way honest things sometimes do when you're tired enough to have stopped managing your own words. I'm going to have to leave eventually, she said. If the medical board responds, if the Voss matter goes forward, there will be a period where I need to be available, so correspondence, possibly testimony. And after that, she stopped. After that, Nathan said. I've been in one place for 6 weeks, she said. The longest I've been anywhere since Sacramento. I don't know what that means. I'm not sure I know how to know. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd said too much. Then, I'm not going to tell you what it means, he said. That's not my business to say, but I can tell you what the last 6 weeks have been like from where I'm sitting. She waited. 15 years I've been running freight at this junction, he said. I know this station the way I know my own hands. I know which crewmen are reliable and which ones need watching and which ones are reliable but need watching for different reasons. I know the morning trains and the night trains, and I know the sound this building makes when the temperature drops below 0. He paused. I didn't know what was missing until something stopped being missing. She looked at him. I'm not good at this kind of talk, he said. I want to be straight with you about that. I don't have the right words for most of what I'm trying to say, but I think you deserve the actual version of it, not the polished one. I don't want a polished version, she said. Good. He met her eyes. Because what I have is this. I offered you a room because it was the right thing to do. I'm asking you to stay because I don't know how to go back to the way this house was before you were in it. Evelyn sat very still. She was 57 years old. She had spent 9 years building a life that didn't require her to be in any specific place, because needing to be somewhere was how you got hurt when you were made to leave. She had been careful, so careful, about not putting weight on things that might not hold. Nathan, she said, her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm not an easy person. I noticed, he said without irony. I have opinions about everything, and I don't generally soften them for the sake of company. I keep records of every patient I've ever treated because I have trust issues with my own memory after a certain hour, and also because I don't trust that goodwill alone will protect me from the next Harlan Voss. I wake up at 4 in the morning, and I can't always get back to sleep. I fix things around the house without asking because waiting for something broken to get fixed makes me anxious. She stopped. And I'm 57. I know how old you are, Nathan said. I'm just being clear. You're listing reasons for me to reconsider, he said. You can stop. I've already considered. She looked at him for a long moment. You're 42, she said. Last I checked. That's 15 years. Evelyn. His voice was even, patient, and quite firm. I spent 12 years building a life that had everything in it that was supposed to make a life whole. I know what it feels like to stand in a room full of the right things and have none of it mean what you thought it would. I also know what it feels like to stand in a room with one person who makes you forget to miss all the rest of it. He stopped. That's the plainest I can put it. Outside, the signal tower bell rang for the last evening train, the sound crossing the cold air with the clean clarity that low temperatures gave to metal. She thought about the morning she'd arrived, the instruments scattered on the frozen platform, the crowd that had watched and then looked away, the suitcase with $11 in the bottom, the way she'd bent down and gathered her things with steady hands because shaking was the thing you couldn't afford. She thought about 6 weeks of coffee on the stove in a room with its own door and 2 people working by lamplight at the same table, and the word "we" arriving in their conversation so gradually that neither of them had noticed the exact moment it started. I need you to understand something, she said. Tell me. I can't promise I won't be difficult to live with, she said. I can't promise that every patient in this town is going to decide to trust me or that the medical board is going to make this easy. I can't promise that Voss is finished causing trouble or that the territory is going to sort itself out on a schedule that's convenient for anyone. I don't need any of those promises, Nathan said. What do you need? He thought about it with the deliberateness she'd come to rely on, the honest, unhurried way he answered questions that deserved an honest, unhurried answer. I need you to tell me if you're thinking about leaving, he said. Not a promise to stay. Just, if you're thinking about going, tell me before you go. That's all I'm asking. It was, she thought, the most reasonable request she'd ever been made in her life. Also the most difficult because it required her to admit that leaving was no longer as simple as it had been 6 weeks ago. All right, she said. I can do that. All right, he said. They sat at the table for another hour, not talking much, the way they'd learned to be in the same room without needing to fill it. She wrote up the last of her patient notes from the storm. He worked through the freight inventory that had been waiting since Saturday. At some point, he got up and put more coffee on, and she said thank you, and he said it was no trouble. And neither of them said anything about the conversation they'd just had, because it had been said already and didn't need repeating. But something was different now. They both knew it. And not mentioning it was itself a form of acknowledgement, the quiet kind that means more than most speeches. In the following days, the junction came back to its regular rhythms in the halting way of a place that has been through something and is still assessing the damage. The tracks were fully clear by Friday. Dr. Peterman arrived on the Saturday morning train, took one look at Nathan's freight office turned medical facility, and spent 20 minutes talking to Evelyn with a focus and respect that was visible from across the platform. Birch watched this and came to find Nathan afterward. Peterman's asking her about the Hofstede case, Birch said, in detail, taking notes. Good, Nathan said. Also asked her about the Ainsley woman and the delivery. He's been writing for about 10 minutes straight. Nathan went back to the freight log he was working on. You're not even going to look? Birch said. I don't need to look, Nathan said. I know what he's seen. Birch stood there for a moment. Cole. What? You look considerably less miserable than you did 2 months ago. Nathan didn't say anything to that. I'm just noting it, Birch said, and went back to the wire office. Evelyn and Dr. Peterman ended up talking for 2 hours, which extended into lunch at the station diner, which was the first meal Evelyn had eaten in a restaurant in 6 weeks. Peterman was a straightforward man with good hands and the slightly battered generosity of a physician who'd been doing rural medicine long enough to have stopped being precious about territory. The board inquiry, he said, over coffee. I heard about it from Aldous Webb, who telegraphed me last week. I didn't know Webb had telegraphed you, Evelyn said. He's thorough, Peterman said. Wanted to make sure my letter to the board on your behalf was on record before the inquiry report was filed. He stirred his coffee. I want to be direct about Millhaven. I should have been in contact with you sooner. What Theodore concealed from you was significant, and I knew, when I saw the full picture, that you'd been working with incomplete information. I should have said that clearly and on the record. I'm sorry I didn't." Evelyn looked at him. "You're saying that now." "I'm saying it now, and I said it to the board," he said. "Webb has the letter, the board has the letter, and I'll say it to anyone else who needs to hear it." He paused. "You did good work in Millhaven. You did remarkable work here. The station agent told me what the freight office looked like during the storm, how many patients you managed, and under what conditions." "There were others helping," she said. "There always are," Peterman said, "but someone has to run it. Someone has to make the calls and keep the records and hold the whole thing together. That was you." She didn't argue. She'd learned over 57 years that accepting a fair assessment wasn't the same as arrogance. "I'd like to talk to the medical board on your behalf," Peterman said. "Not just the letter. In person, when they convene in March, if you'll allow it." "Why?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Because you're good, and they should know it. Because Voss used their process as a weapon, and they should know that too. And because Redstone Junction needs a reliable medical presence, and in case it hasn't been made apparent to you yet, the Junction seems to have decided you're it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not licensed under territorial statute," she said. "There's a provision, Section 12, 1874. I know." She almost smiled. "I looked it up the second day I was here." Peterman stared at her, then laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him. "Of course you did." She walked back from the station in the late afternoon, the cold still serious, but the sky clear, and the light that particular quality of winter light that turns everything clean-edged and honest. The tracks ran east and west into the distance, 2 lines of iron going different directions, and the signal tower stood steady above the yard. She had a room with its own door and a stove that worked, and a man who left coffee on in the mornings. She had a patient list of 47 people and a reputation that was still fragile but no longer entirely hostile. She had letters in motion that she hadn't sent alone, and a case being built in Carson City by a man she'd never met who was working from documentation she'd compiled with steady hands and borrowed light. She stopped on the platform for a moment, where 6 weeks ago she'd knelt on the frozen boards and gathered her instruments without letting her hands shake. The platform looked different now. Not because it had changed, the same bricks, the same iron rail, the same coal smoke smell. But the way you see a place changes when you've been in it long enough to know what happened there, what you survived there, what you didn't have yet when you arrived. Nathan was at the far end of the platform, talking with one of the crew supervisors. He looked up and saw her standing there, and for a moment, across the length of the platform, they just looked at each other. He raised a hand, a small gesture, the kind that doesn't mean anything particular and means everything in context. She raised one back. Then she went inside because it was cold and she had notes to write, and the evening train was due in 40 minutes, and she'd told Declan's wife Clara she'd stop by to check on the mother-in-law's hands before supper. She had work to do. She had somewhere to be. For the first time in 9 years, those two things were in the same place. The letter from the Territorial Medical Board arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of March, carried on the eastbound train in the regular mail pouch, and handed to Birch, who handed it to Evelyn with an expression that suggested he'd been mentally rehearsing the moment since it left Carson City. She took it without ceremony and put it in her coat pocket. "You're not going to open it?" Birch said. "Later," she said. "Evelyn." "I have a patient in 20 minutes, Birch." He stared at her with the exasperation of a man who processes other people's urgent news for a living and cannot understand why anyone would voluntarily delay receiving their own. "It's your entire professional future in an envelope." "Then it'll keep for an hour," she said, and went to see her patient. The patient was old Mr. Ferris, 71, who had a chest complaint that had been coming and going since the blizzard, and who came to Evelyn's side of Nathan's house every Tuesday at 9 because, he said, it was the most reliable appointment he had in the week, and he liked having something reliable. She listened to his lungs, adjusted the steam treatment she'd prescribed, and reminded him again about the damp in his room at the boarding house, which he continued to do nothing about, and she continued to mention because that was the shape of their relationship now. After he left, she sat at the table for a moment with the envelope in front of her. She was 57 years old, and she had been doing this work for 31 years, and she had earned, through those years, a perfectly clear conscience about her practice. She knew that. She also knew that a clear conscience didn't guarantee a favorable outcome from a panel of men 300 miles away who had received a complaint from a well-connected holding company and were weighing it against a letter from a rural physician and a file of patient documentation from a woman with no permanent address. She opened the envelope. She read it twice. Then she sat still for a while. The knock at the door was Nathan, which she'd expected. He had a way of appearing when things happen, not hovering, just present. "Well?" he said. She held up the letter. He crossed the room and took it and read it standing, and she watched his face, which was still and careful until it wasn't. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatic, just a loosening, the way a man's face changes when he puts down something heavy. "The complaint is dismissed," he said. "Formally withdrawn by the complainant," she said, "which is different. It means Voss pulled it himself rather than letting the board rule on it." Nathan set the letter down. "Webb." "Webb and Peterman both," she said. "The board's note says they received information suggesting the complaint may have been filed in bad faith in connection with a matter under investigation by the Territorial Attorney General's office." She paused. "Voss withdrew it before they could rule against him. He didn't want the ruling on record." "Smart," Nathan said. "Still a loss for him." "A significant one," Evelyn said. "A complaint that's dismissed for bad faith follows the filer, not the accused. If he tries this with anyone else in any other territory, it's already on his record," Nathan said. "Yes." He sat down across from her. The morning light was coming through the window at the angle it always came at this time of year. Low, winter clear, the kind of light that showed everything without softening it. "How do you feel?" he asked. It was a simple question, and she took it seriously. "Relieved," she said, "and tired in a way that's different from the tired I've been feeling for 3 months. Tired like something is over." "Something is," he said. "And also—" She stopped, finding the right word. "Angry. Still. Not at anyone specific, just at the amount of energy that went into defending something I should have been able to take for granted." She looked at her hands on the table. 31 years of work, hundreds of patients, and I still spent 3 months building a case for why I deserve to continue doing what I've always done, because one man with money decided I was a useful target. Nathan didn't rush to fill the space after that. He let it sit, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him. "I know that's not a tidy thing to feel on a day when the news is good," she said. "It's an honest thing," he said. "That's better than tidy." She looked at him across the table, this quiet and serious man who had offered her a room on a frozen platform 6 weeks ago because it was the right thing to do, and who had never once asked her to be easier than she was. "What do you want to do today?" he said. She almost laughed. Of all the things he could have said. "I want to write to Peterman," she said, "and to Webb, and then I want to go to the station and see if there's anything that needs doing." "There's always something that needs doing," Nathan said. "I know," she said. "That's why I like it there." The letter to Elias Drum at the land office came 3 days later, and it contained the kind of news that moved slowly because it had to be arranged carefully before it could be released. What Drum had found, working through the official records in Carson City with the information Evelyn had sent him in February, was that the survey maps Voss had been shipping under the holding company name were pre-publication documents, property of the Territorial Survey Office, not available to private parties. Someone inside the survey office had been providing them. Drum hadn't said who in the letter, only that the matter was now being investigated formally by the Attorney General's office, which Webb had confirmed in a separate wire to Nathan the same afternoon. The timber company in St. Louis had been notified that the survey results were invalid pending the investigation. The land purchases Voss had been setting up, the foreclosures he'd been positioning himself to execute once the survey went public, were frozen. Gruber's ranch was safe. For now. Nathan told Evelyn about the wire over dinner, reading from his notes in the spare, factual way he had of delivering information. She listened to the whole thing. "Gruber doesn't know yet," Nathan said. "We should tell him," Evelyn said. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll go with you." She nodded. Then, "What happens to Voss?" "Drum says it depends on what the investigation finds. If they can prove he knew the maps were stolen rather than just that he received them, that's a criminal matter. Nathan set down his notes. Webb thinks they have enough. He said the holding company's correspondence was, he used the word incriminating. And if it doesn't go criminal? He still loses the scheme, Nathan said. The foreclosures are frozen. The land he was positioning to buy at debt prices is no longer available. Whatever he paid Gruber's creditors for those notes, he paid cash for something he can't execute. It wasn't a courtroom verdict. She understood that. Men like Voss were rarely completely stopped. They were redirected, inconvenienced, forced to move their operations to places where nobody had yet thought to look. But Gruber's ranch would stand. The dry goods owner would keep his store. The people in Redstone Junction who'd built their lives on the land Voss had been quietly circling would go home without knowing how close it had come. That was something. That was, in fact, a great deal. Nathan, she said. Thank you. She said it plainly, without elaboration. For the freight records, and for Webb, and for not letting me carry all of it alone, even when I was trying to. He looked at her across the table with that steady, unhurried expression. You built the case, he said. We built it, she said. Don't be humble. It doesn't suit you. He almost smiled. No, he said. I don't suppose it does. The visit to Gruber's ranch was on a Thursday, 2 days later, cold but clear. The kind of late winter day where the sky is a hard, clean blue and the ground is still frozen, but the air carries the first faint suggestion that it won't always be. Otto Gruber was a man of about 65, widowed, with the large weathered hands of someone who had worked land his whole life, and the particular stillness of someone who'd been waiting for bad news long enough that he'd stopped flinching at the approach of visitors. He opened his door and looked at them. Nathan, he knew. Evelyn he'd seen at the station but never spoken to, and said, Come in then. They sat at his kitchen table and Nathan told him. Evelyn watched Gruber's face as he listened. He didn't react dramatically, which she'd expected. Men who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time often didn't, when the weight was lifted. The body takes a moment to understand it's not holding anymore. The notes are frozen, Gruber said when Nathan finished. Voss can't call them? Not while the investigation is active, Nathan said. And if they find what they think they'll find, the notes may be invalidated entirely as part of a fraudulent scheme. You'd need a lawyer to confirm that. I'm telling you what Drum told me. Gruber was quiet for a while. He looked at the table and then out the window at the bare fields. I've been on this land for 31 years, he said. My wife is buried on this land. He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. I thought I was going to lose it because of a bad cattle year and a man who showed up with a friendly face and a briefcase full of papers I didn't read carefully enough. You read them carefully enough to keep making payments, Evelyn said. That matters. It meant there was a record. He looked at her. You're the healer woman, the one from the platform. Yes, she said. My neighbor's wife, he said. Mrs. Ainsley. She talked about you. He paused. Said you stayed with her while her husband was on the line. She needed someone to stay, Evelyn said. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd been considering. Then he said, Can I make you both coffee? And the directness of it, the ordinary human instinct to offer something when you've been given something, made Evelyn feel more than the board's letter had that morning. We'd appreciate that, she said. They stayed for an hour. They drank the coffee, which was strong and slightly burned, and talked about the cattle markets and the spring planting, and the state of the Eastern Road, and the kinds of things people talk about when what they really mean is, I thought I was finished, and I'm not. Gruber shook Nathan's hand when they left, and then, with the slightly awkward deliberateness of a man who doesn't do it often, shook Evelyn's too. On the drive back, Nathan said, He'll be all right. Yes, Evelyn said. He will. The road was quiet around them, the horse moving at an easy pace, the bare fields running out to the tree line on both sides. I've been thinking, Nathan said. About what? About the station master's office. She looked at him. It's been empty since Hargrove retired in November, he said. The railroad hasn't filled the position. The room is solid. Good stove, 2 windows, space enough for an examination table and a proper cabinet. He kept his eyes on the road. I talked to the regional supervisor last week. Informally. About what exactly? She said carefully. About whether the railroad would consider leasing the space to a medical practitioner, he said. Given that they've been losing workdays to injuries and illness treated out of freight offices and private homes, and given that the station doesn't have permanent medical coverage, and given that the territorial statute makes provision for Section 12, she said. Section 12, he confirmed. The supervisor was interested, more than interested. He said he'd put it to the regional board. She sat with this. A room with 2 windows and a proper stove and a cabinet at the station, permanent, under her own name. You did this without telling me, she said. I did it informally, he said. I wanted to see if there was something to tell you before I told you. Nathan. I know, he said. I should have said something, but I also know you, and if I'd said I was thinking about asking and it came to nothing, I'd have been fine, she said. You'd have added it to the list of things that almost worked out, he said, and that list is already too long. She couldn't argue with that. The supervisor wants to meet with you, Nathan said. Next week, if you're willing. Nothing formal, just a conversation. All right, she said. He glanced at her sideways. All right, that's it? What did you want me to say? I don't know, he admitted. Something. I think it's a good idea, she said. I think you went about it in a way that was well-intentioned but slightly overcautious. And I think we should probably talk about that tendency in general, but yes, I think it's a good idea. He was quiet for a moment, then, the talking about the tendency in general? Not today, she said. All right, he said, and there was something in his voice that was the closest thing to levity she'd heard from him, and she filed that away with the other things she was learning about Nathan Cole. They drove back to Redstone Junction in the kind of comfortable quiet that takes a long time to build between 2 people and is, when it arrives, one of the better things a life can offer. The meeting with the railroad supervisor happened on a Friday afternoon in the regional office above the freight building, and it lasted 45 minutes. The supervisor was a man named Holt, somewhere in his 50s, with the practical intelligence of someone who ran operations and thought in terms of outcomes. He asked her about her qualifications. She told him in the same direct way she told everyone, the years of practice, the territorial statute provision, the letter from the medical board. She did not minimize and she did not embellish. He asked her about the blizzard. She told him what had happened. The numbers, the cases, the outcomes. 47 patients in 72 hours. No deaths among those who'd been under her care. A delivery completed successfully under difficult conditions. A man who'd arrived in serious respiratory distress and had left on the train to a hospital stable enough to travel. Holt listened to all of this and then said, "What would you need to set up a proper clinic?" She had a list. She'd written it the night before because she'd known this question was coming and she didn't want to arrive at it underprepared. She handed him the paper. He read it. He turned it over, looked at the back, turned it face up again. "This is reasonable," he said. "I know," she said. He looked up at her with the expression of a man reassessing something. "You're not going to negotiate it down." "It's already what I need, not what I want," she said. "If I could add to it, I would, but that's the minimum for a functioning clinic." He nodded slowly. "The lease would be 6 months initially, renewable if both parties are satisfied." "That's acceptable," she said. "The railroad's name would be on the facility." "My name would also be on the facility," she said, "as the practicing clinician. That's not negotiable." He considered this for approximately 3 seconds. Agreed. They shook hands across his desk, and Evelyn walked back down the stairs into the freight bay where Nathan was waiting with the particular expression of a man who was trying to look like he wasn't waiting. "Well," he said. 6-month lease," she said. "Renewable." He let out a breath. "Good." "My name is on the door," she said. "Obviously," he said. "You say obviously like you expected it. You were the one who made this happen. You were the one who made this possible," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment in the dim light of the freight bay, this man who thought in terms of what was necessary and did it without needing anyone to see him do it, who had offered her a room and kept firewood stocked and made 4 things for dinner and held a lamp steady for 40 minutes while she worked on a stranger's leg, and who had gone quietly to a railroad supervisor and built something she hadn't thought to ask for. "Nathan," she said. "I know," he said. "Don't make it into a speech." "I wasn't going to make a speech," she said. "I was going to ask if you wanted to get dinner." He looked at her. "At the diner?" she said. "An actual dinner? Not salt pork and boiled potatoes." "I can make other things," he said. "You said you could make 4 things. There are 4 things. The potatoes are one of them." "Dinner," she said. "At the diner. My treat." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "My knee's been bothering me anyway. I wasn't looking forward to standing at the stove." "I know your knee's been bothering you," she said. "You've been favoring it since Tuesday. Why didn't you say something?" "I knew you'd notice," he said. "That's not a reason not to say something. That's a reason to say something sooner." "Evelyn." "What?" "Dinner," he said. She almost laughed. "Yes, dinner." They had dinner at the station diner, which was warm and loud and smelled of good coffee and something frying. And they sat across from each other at a table by the window and ordered the same thing and ate it without much ceremony and talked about the clinic layout and the supply chain and whether Marguerite, the retired Army nurse, could be convinced to come back for a month to help set up the systems properly. Marguerite had left on the eastbound train after the blizzard, but had left an address and the specific statement that if Evelyn ever needed a hand with something real, she should write. Evelyn was planning to write. The conversation covered the practical and occasionally wandered into the personal and came back to the practical, the way conversations do when 2 people are also trying to work out what they are to each other without saying it directly. And it was a good dinner, the kind that lasts longer than the food. When they walked back from the diner, the night was clear and cold, the stars overhead the dense winter kind, and the signal tower light was moving in its slow rotation, throwing a regular bead of illumination across the snow-covered yard. They walked without hurrying. Nathan's limp was slight, and she didn't comment on it again because she'd said what needed saying, and repeating herself about medical matters was something she saved for the genuinely obstinate. And Nathan wasn't obstinate so much as he was private about discomfort, which was different and required a different approach. At the point where the path to the house branched toward her door, they stopped without deciding to. "There's something I've been thinking about," Nathan said. "What?" He turned to look at her, in the particular way he looked at her when he was about to say something he'd been working out for a while. "I've been alone in that house for 6 years, since Margaret left. I thought I'd built a way of being alone that was sufficient, reasonable, that I'd made the parts of it work that needed to work." She waited. "And then you arrived," he said, "and I understood that sufficient and reasonable are not the same as good, that I'd been managing something instead of living it, and I'm 52 years too old to go back to managing." He stopped. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "You're doing fine," she said. "What I mean is—" He stopped again. He looked for a moment like a man who has discovered that the simple version of what he wants to say is actually the most accurate. "Will you marry me?" It wasn't exactly a question, the way he said it. It had the quality of a statement that wanted to be confirmed. She stood there in the cold, clear night and thought about all the reasons this was complicated. She was 57. She'd been a widow for 9 years. She'd spent those years becoming someone who didn't need a particular place or person to be functional, and that self-sufficiency was real and hard-won. And she didn't want to give it up. She also thought about what it had cost her, that self-sufficiency, what she'd paid for it, all the rooms she'd slept in that she'd left no trace of, all the people she'd helped who didn't know her name 6 months later, all the mornings she'd woken up and taken stock of herself and found everything in order and nothing that particularly needed her to stay. She thought about a room with its own door and a stove that worked and coffee on at 5 in the morning, and a man who held a lamp steady and listened when she talked and went quietly to railroad supervisors on her behalf without needing to be thanked for it. She thought about what belonging felt like when you stopped treating it like something you could afford to lose. "Yes," she said, just that. One word. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already decided to believe, and she thought that was exactly right. Not a performance of joy, not an overwhelming of emotion, just the honest recognition of two people who had found something real and were willing to say so. He reached over and took her hand, there in the cold in the yard, and held it in the straightforward way of a man who was doing what seemed natural and wasn't going to make more of it than it was, and that too was exactly right. They went inside. The spring came slowly, the way it comes in rail towns in the high country, grudging and incremental, a week of warmth followed by a cold snap, the mud arriving before the green did. But by April the tracks were clear, and the freight was moving, and the station at Redstone Junction had the busy, purposeful energy of a place that has come through something difficult and found its footing again. The clinic in the old station master's office opened on the 12th of April, on a morning when the sky was clear and the air still had an edge to it, but the light was already the lighter kind, the kind that belonged to the season that was coming rather than the one that had passed. Evelyn had spent 2 weeks setting it up. The examination table, the cabinet, the supply shelves organized by type, in the way she'd been organizing them since she was 26, the small desk in the corner where she'd write her notes at the end of each day. Marguerite had come for 3 weeks as promised, and the system they'd built together was solid and sensible and required only one person to run, which was important because one person was what they had. Her name was on the door. Evelyn Cole, medical practitioner. Railroads made you use a surname. She'd chosen Nathan's without any particular deliberation because she was going to take it in 6 weeks anyway when they married at the courthouse in Callaway, and because her own name had spent 31 years attached to qualifications that kept being questioned, and she found she didn't mind attaching it to something that meant something different. Nathan had said, when she told him she was putting his name on the door, "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "I want to." He'd looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he was feeling something he didn't have words for yet and wasn't going to manufacture words just to fill the space. "All right," he'd said. "All right," she'd agreed. On the morning the clinic opened, Declan showed up first with Clara and their 3 children and a tin of cookies that Clara had made and which were, honestly, excellent. Then Birch came, and the station agent whose name was Willoughby and who had spent 3 months giving her sideways looks and had recently started saying good morning in a way that seemed to involve his whole face. Then Dr. Peterman, who had driven up from Callaway because he said he wanted to see it himself, and who shook her hand and said her setup was better organized than anything he'd seen outside a city hospital, which she took as the highest compliment he was capable of. Ruth Ainsley came with her husband and the baby, who was 2 months old now and healthy and loud about it. Old Mr. Ferris came because it was Tuesday, and he had a standing appointment and no one had told him it was a different Tuesday from the usual. Toby Marsh came, the brakeman who'd been in the room when Voss showed up at her door and grinned at the sign on the door like he'd won something personally. Gruber came. She hadn't expected that. His ranch was 15 miles out. But he arrived on horseback at mid-morning, hat in hand, and said he'd heard there was an opening and he wanted to see it. She showed him around the clinic, which took about 4 minutes because it wasn't large, and he looked at everything with the quiet assessment of a man who understood what it meant to have a place for your work. "My neighbor's boy," he said when they were done. 11 years old, been coughing since the blizzard. His parents haven't had him seen. "Send him in," Evelyn said, "Tuesday or Thursday mornings." He nodded. He put his hat back on. At the door he stopped. "That man," he said. "Voss. I heard the investigation is moving forward." "That's what Drum's last letter said," she confirmed. Gruber was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. Then he went. Nathan came by at noon with food from the diner because she'd been in the clinic since 7 and he knew she wouldn't have eaten. He set it on her desk without commentary and leaned against the wall and ate his own lunch while she finished a note she was writing. "How's it going?" he said. 9 patients this morning, she said. 3 follow-ups from the blizzard, 4 new presentations, and Mr. Ferris, who didn't know it was a special occasion and therefore treated it like every other Tuesday, which was actually the most reassuring thing that happened. Nathan smiled at that, a real smile, not the almost smile she'd gotten used to, and she still wasn't entirely accustomed to seeing it, which was fine with her. "Gruber came," she said. "I saw his horse out front. He's sending his neighbor's boy in, cough since the blizzard." She picked up her lunch. "Nathan, What you did. The supervisor, the lease, the door. It matters more than I've said. You said thank you, he said. I said thank you for the gesture, she said. I mean what it represents. A door with my name on it. Work that belongs to me. She looked at him steadily. I spent 22 years building something in another man's name and then watched it become his when he was gone. I want you to understand what it means that this one's mine. He held her gaze. I understand, he said. That's why I made sure your name was on the door. She ate her lunch. There were things she'd been thinking lately that nobody prepared you for about the second half of a life. The way it arrived without your consent, rearranging what you'd thought was settled. The way the things you'd built to protect yourself could become the very walls that closed you in, if you weren't careful. The way the people who mattered most often showed up unannounced and impractical and entirely inconvenient, like an injured man at a storage room door 2 hours after you'd moved into the storage room. She'd spent 9 years being careful. She'd become very good at it. She could assess a situation and identify the exits and calculate how much she could lose if it went wrong. And for 9 years, that calculation had kept her moving and kept her safe and kept her from having anything she couldn't walk away from. What she'd understood, slowly, over the course of a winter in Redstone Junction, was that the things you could walk away from were also the things that couldn't hold you, that safety and belonging existed in genuine tension, and that choosing one meant accepting the limits of the other, and that at 57 she was finished choosing safety as a substitute for living. She was not a simpler person for having understood this. She was, if anything, more complicated, more aware of what she wanted and less able to pretend she didn't want it. But she was also here, in a clinic with her name on the door, in a town she'd been told to leave before she'd been in it an hour, building a life with a quiet and serious man who had offered her a room because it was the right thing to do and asked her to stay because he couldn't imagine the alternative. That was not a perfect story. She'd been in enough places and seen enough lives to know that no story was perfect, and the ones that claimed to be were usually leaving something out. She and Nathan had 15 years between them in age, and 9 years of different histories and a whole set of habits each built for living alone. And those things didn't disappear because they decided to stop pretending they were content with sufficient. But they were both people who did what was necessary, who kept records, who didn't look away from difficult things, who understood that the work was the work regardless of whether anyone was watching, and that the only honest measure of a life was whether you left the people you encountered better than you found them. On that measure, she thought, they'd do. The afternoon train came through at 3, as it always did, its whistle cutting across the junction in the clean way that train whistles cut across the distance. Through the clinic window, she could see the platform filling with the familiar motion of arrivals and departures, people coming and going, the particular transient life of a rail town where everyone was passing through, and some of them, without knowing it yet, were already home. She watched from the window for a moment. 9 years ago, she'd stood on a platform not unlike this one with a borrowed bag and the remains of a practice that had never legally been hers, and she'd understood that she was going to have to build her way back to something, that the version of herself she'd been was not going to be available again, and that whatever came next would have to be made from what she had left. What she'd had left was the work, the knowledge, the steadiness, the refusal to let her hands shake when everything else was trying to shake them. It had been enough to get her here. To this room, to this town, to a door with her name on it and a man drinking coffee at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning who never asked her to be less than she was. She turned back to her desk and picked up her pen. Mr. Ferris's chart needed updating. There was a letter to write to Marguerite about the supply inventory. Gruber's neighbor's boy would need a file set up before Tuesday. Outside, the train whistled again, departing now, heading east. And the sound faded across the distance the way all departures do, and Evelyn Harper Cole sat at her desk in her clinic and did her work, and did not watch it go.